Police ignore homeless man's call for help, then discover his Navy past. Lisa Monroe had always prided herself on being a good cop. Portland's downtown beat, with its winding streets, old brick buildings, and constant stream of people, had become familiar to her over the years, so much so that the sounds of city life, horns honking, the murmur of conversation, the screech of the train on the tracks, had become a kind of backdrop to her own steady rhythm. As an officer, she had learned to compartmentalize, to tune out distractions and focus on the job at hand. Her uniform, a neat but functional shade of navy blue, was a symbol of order in a city that sometimes felt like it was constantly teetering on the edge of chaos. She had been working for nearly a decade now, and her presence had come to be expected on these streets. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. There were some people who looked at her and saw authority. Others saw an ally, someone who could be counted on in a pinch. But no one really saw her anymore. Not in the way that mattered. And she liked it that way. Lisa knew that working in law enforcement could make you cynical. After all, the job was a constant exposure to the darker sides of human nature. She had seen it all: petty thefts, domestic disputes, the occasional drunken brawl, and sometimes, much worse, murders, rapes, and robberies that left families shattered. But the most difficult aspect of her job had always been the homeless population. They were a fixture of the city, present in every corner of downtown Portland. And they were a part of the rhythm of the city, an inevitable consequence of urban life. Lisa had seen thousands of faces like theirs, people wrapped in layers of torn clothing, faces marked by years of hardship, hands extended out for change, or simply for attention. Some she recognized as regulars, having seen them on the same street corners day after day, week after week. Others were more transient, appearing only when the weather turned cold or when the shelters were full. But one thing they all shared was that, after a while, they became invisible. It wasn't that Lisa didn't care. At least, she tried to convince herself of that. It was just that, over time, she had learned to develop a kind of professional detachment, an ability to separate her emotions from the job. She was good at her work. She had to be. This was the only way she could get through the long hours, the constant grind of handling everything that came with being a beat cop in a bustling city. And so, the homeless became part of the scenery. When she passed by them, Lisa didn't often engage. She would nod at them occasionally, offer a curt "you okay?" if they were sitting alone or seemed distressed, but that was usually the extent of it. The city had a network of shelters, food pantries, and outreach programs. She trusted the system to handle them. She trusted the system to fix them. In her mind, that was where her responsibility ended. She wasn't a social worker or a counselor. She was a police officer. It wasn't her job to save everyone, and she had enough on her plate to keep her busy without adding the weight of someone else's life story to her own. That morning, as the first gray light of dawn began to spill over the city, Lisa was walking her usual route, heading toward the intersection of 5th and Pine. Her boots clicked on the wet pavement, the sound of her steps muffled by the thick fog rolling off the Willamette River. The day was cool but not cold, a typical late fall morning in Portland. The city had that quiet, almost sleepy feel before the day fully awakened, but Lisa knew that wouldn't last long. Soon, the streets would be crowded with office workers, tourists, and shoppers, each of them rushing through their daily routines without a second thought to the people who lived on the fringes of society. As Lisa walked, her eyes flicked to the usual spots: under the overpass, behind the dumpsters in the alleyway, along the edges of the park where people sometimes set up makeshift tents. She scanned the area, a habit that had become second nature over the years. It was always the same faces: the older man sitting against the wall, the woman huddled with her dog, the group of teenagers trying to sell cigarettes. But today, as she passed the entrance to a small alley, she noticed a figure who wasn't familiar. The man was unkempt, his clothes mismatched and worn through at the elbows and knees. His face was unshaven, the stubble thick and patchy, his hair wild and graying. His skin, pale but weathered, seemed stretched tight over his bones. But what caught Lisa's attention the most was the expression in his eyes. They were tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much. But there was something else in them too, something that stopped Lisa in her tracks for a moment. She didn't know what it was, but it was enough to make her pause. The man was sitting on the curb, one knee pulled up to his chest. His head was down, as if he were gathering the strength to stand, but when he noticed Lisa, he looked up and there was a flicker of something in his gaze. It wasn't desperation exactly, but something close, perhaps an appeal for help. Something that made Lisa hesitate, just for a moment, as she walked past. "Excuse me, officer," the man said, his voice rough but steady. I could really use some help." Lisa didn't stop walking at first. This was the moment she had seen 1,000 times before, another homeless person asking for help. She had heard it all. The requests for money, for food, for a place to sleep. She had even heard the heart-wrenching stories of people who had fallen through the cracks, lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost everything. It was a constant parade of pain and loss, and as much as Lisa cared, she couldn't take on the weight of all their stories. She had her own life to lead, her own responsibilities. She couldn't fix all the problems of the world. Lisa's gaze flicked briefly to the man's outstretched hand. He wasn't asking for money, at least not yet. Instead, his voice was steady, almost pleading, though he wasn't aggressive. "I just need a place to sleep for the night," he continued, his words slow but careful, as though he had practiced them. "I'm not asking for much, just a roof over my head." Lisa looked away, scanning the street ahead. She could see the local shelter a few blocks down, the sign for the Veterans Outreach Program just across the street. She knew the resources were there. If he was truly in need, they would help him. They were trained for this. She wasn't. She had already given her answer, even if she hadn't said the words out loud. "I'll let someone know," Lisa said, her tone matter-of-fact. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was the same line she had used hundreds of times before, a polite but professional way of brushing someone off without confrontation. She didn't even wait for a response, turning away quickly and continuing on her route. The man didn't call out after her, didn't protest. Lisa didn't hear anything more from him as she moved down the street. For a moment, she felt the faintest flicker of guilt, but she quickly pushed it aside. This was the job. It was what she had to do. It was easier to move on, to focus on what was in front of her rather than the complexities of one man's life. After all, she had done her part. She had acknowledged him. That was enough. But as the minutes passed, as the quiet hum of the city grew louder around her, something gnawed at her. She couldn't explain it. She had seen countless homeless people over the years, but something about that man, something in the way he looked at her, stayed with her. It wasn't just his plea for help. It was the way he had seemed defeated. For the rest of the day, Lisa found herself distracted. She could see the image of the man's face behind her eyelids every time she closed her eyes. She didn't know why it affected her so much. After all, there were so many others just like him. And yet, something about that fleeting moment of connection felt different. But by the time Lisa made it home that evening, she had convinced herself that it was just a passing thought. She was tired, and she had other things to focus on. She tried to shake the feeling, reminding herself that she had a job to do, and the system was there to handle the rest. Still, as she sank into her couch later that night, her mind kept wandering back to him. Who was he? What was his story? Little did Lisa know, that quiet rejection, so casual and dismissive at the time, would be the first turning point in a story that would change both their lives forever. The evening passed quietly, the sounds of the city slipping into a soft hum of distant conversations, car engines, and the occasional siren. Lisa sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee, half finished, in front of her. She hadn't even noticed that she was absent-mindedly stirring it, the swirling motion helping her mind drift further from the events of the day. It had been a busy shift, nothing extraordinary, just the usual complaints and paperwork, but something about her encounter with the homeless man earlier lingered like a dull ache in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the image of him sitting on the curb, looking up at her with those tired eyes, waiting for something that she had not given him, real attention, real help. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already after 10 p.m., and Lisa had planned to be in bed by now. But instead of feeling the exhaustion that usually came after a long day on patrol, she felt a kind of restlessness. The city outside her window was quiet now, save for the occasional car passing by, its headlights casting shadows on the street. But in her head, the world felt louder than ever, filled with unanswered questions and half-formed thoughts. Lisa had always been one to focus on the job. She was a good cop, and she'd built a reputation for herself as someone who could get the job done without getting too emotionally involved. After all, she had been trained to keep her distance. Her first year on the force had been the hardest. She had seen the worst of human nature in that time: violent crimes, tragic accidents, and the kinds of things that left permanent scars on the people involved. But she had learned early on that if she let those scars affect her, she wouldn't be able to do her job. If she let herself feel too deeply for the victims, or worse, for the perpetrators, she would lose her sense of professionalism. She couldn't afford that. And so, she had built walls, strong, invisible barriers that allowed her to go through the motions without ever truly feeling them. But tonight, as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, the walls felt like they were starting to crack. She set the spoon down in her cup, pushing it aside as she leaned back in her chair. Her mind kept returning to the man, Tom. She remembered his name now. It had taken her a while to place him in her memory, but when she thought back, she realized she had seen him a few times before, over the years. He wasn't a regular fixture in the same spots as some of the other homeless people, but he had been around. She could picture him now, tall, thin, his posture slouched as if the weight of the world was too much for him to bear. He wasn't the kind of person who would make you do a double take, someone who blended in easily with the background of city life. But there was something about him, something she hadn't fully recognized at the time, that kept drawing her back. Lisa rubbed her eyes, feeling the weight of the day catching up with her. But the more she thought about Tom, the more she began to question her own reaction to him. Why had she brushed him off so easily? Why hadn't she taken the time to listen? The words she had said to him, "I'll let someone know," replayed in her mind like an echo, distant but insistent. She had meant it as a polite way to dismiss him, to make it clear that she wasn't going to help directly, but that the system would. And yet, that wasn't what he had needed. He didn't need the system. He needed someone to see him, to acknowledge him as a person, as someone who had a life, a history, a future. She realized that she had been treating him the same way she treated so many others, as just another problem, another statistic, another face in the crowd. In that moment, she had been the very thing she had sworn never to become, an officer of the law who had lost sight of the human beings behind the badges and reports, someone who had turned into a cog in a machine that was far too big to care about the individuals caught in it. Her discomfort with the situation deepened. Lisa had spent years convincing herself that her approach was the right one. After all, how could she possibly help everyone? She wasn't a social worker, she wasn't trained in mental health, and she certainly wasn't a therapist. The reality was that, while she had always tried to do her job well, she had grown increasingly detached from the people she was supposed to protect. When she was younger, she had joined the force because she believed in making a difference. She had wanted to help people, to be someone others could turn to when they needed assistance. But as the years had passed, her idealism had been chipped away by the grind of routine calls and procedural duties. Now, she didn't feel that spark of passion for her work. She had allowed herself to fall into the trap of bureaucracy, of doing what was expected, of following orders without ever stopping to question whether what she was doing was truly making a difference. This realization hit her with a force that felt almost physical. She didn't know how it had happened. How she had gone from the ambitious young officer who had been full of hope and drive to the jaded, emotionally distant cop who just went through the motions. But somehow, the world around her had turned gray. The faces she had once seen with empathy were now just names on a report or cases to be solved. She couldn't even remember the last time she had felt truly connected to her work. When had she last taken the time to truly listen to someone, to care for them beyond the surface level? The answer, unfortunately, was clear. It had been a long time. Lisa stood up from the table, pacing her small apartment as her thoughts swirled. She thought about Tom again. She thought about how he had looked at her with a kind of quiet desperation, not angry, not accusatory, but pleading in a way that felt different from the usual requests she heard on the street. It was as if, in that brief interaction, he had been asking for something more than just a place to sleep or a handout. He had been asking to be seen, and she had failed him. The thought stung in a way that was hard to articulate, but it was there, lodged deep in her chest. Her sense of guilt grew. She had always prided herself on doing the right thing, on making sure people were safe, on following the law. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had been blind to the larger issues at play. She had been so focused on solving immediate problems, like issuing tickets or responding to complaints, that she had lost sight of the root causes: the poverty, the mental health crises, the trauma that led so many people to the streets. She had failed to see the bigger picture. She thought about the veterans she had encountered over the years. Some of them, like Tom, had served their country with honor, only to return home and find themselves abandoned, forgotten. They had risked their lives in foreign wars, only to be left to fend for themselves when they returned to the streets of their own cities. The more she thought about it, the more she felt sickened by the disparity between the respect they were shown when in uniform and the contempt they often faced once they were no longer serving. Was this really the system she had signed up to protect? Lisa felt the stirring of something within her that she hadn't felt in years. It was a long-forgotten desire, buried beneath the weight of cynicism and routine. It was the desire to make a difference, to fight for something bigger than herself. She had joined the force because she had wanted to help people, to protect them, to bring some semblance of justice to the world. But somewhere along the way, she had lost her way. And Tom had reminded her of that. The desire to act, to make things right, began to burn inside her. But she wasn't sure where to begin. She didn't have the answers. She didn't even know where Tom had gone after their brief exchange. But one thing was clear: she couldn't just let it go. She couldn't go back to her old way of thinking. She had to do something. The question that lingered now wasn't just about what Tom needed, it was about what she needed. Was it enough to simply keep doing the same thing, or did she need to change, too? Could she be the kind of officer who actually made a difference, who didn't just walk past the suffering, who didn't just file reports and move on? In the silence of her apartment, Lisa made a decision. She was going to find Tom. She didn't know how yet, and she didn't know what she could do for him, but she knew she had to try. She couldn't let herself be another person who walked away, who allowed the city's problems to become someone else's responsibility. She had to be more than just a passive observer. And so, as she grabbed her coat and stepped out the door, something inside her shifted. For the first time in a long while, Lisa Monroe felt alive with purpose. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to walk past the pain anymore. Not this time. The next morning, Lisa found herself staring at the streets of Portland, the city that had become both a second home and a place of emotional distance. Her uniform felt heavier today, not because of the weight of her duties, but because of the weight of the choice she had made. She hadn't expected to feel this way, nervous, uncertain, maybe even a little foolish. The streets she had walked for years, each corner familiar and well-known, suddenly felt like a maze. The idea of truly helping someone, like really helping them, not just giving them a place to sleep or handing them a voucher for food, seemed daunting, almost impossible. She had made up her mind. She would find Tom. She had to. He wasn't just another face in the crowd, another homeless individual to be passed by. He had been a reminder of the life she had once dreamed of, a life where she actually made a difference, where she fought for justice in a world that often ignored the suffering of its most vulnerable. She couldn't ignore him anymore. And so, Lisa set out to track him down, though she wasn't entirely sure where to begin. The plan was simple in theory: retrace her steps from yesterday and see if she could find him again. But as soon as she stepped onto the streets, the reality of the situation hit her. She didn't know where to look. Portland's downtown was a network of alleyways, street corners, and overpasses. There were dozens of homeless people scattered around, each with their own stories, their own routines. Tom had been one of many. He hadn't stood out in a crowd, except for those eyes, those tired, searching eyes. But now, even that detail seemed vague. She hadn't looked closely enough to remember the precise location, the exact street corner. Lisa's first stop was the corner of 5th and Pine, where she had seen him the day before. She approached it carefully, eyes scanning the crowd, trying to spot any sign of him. She didn't know what she expected to find. Maybe Tom sitting on the same curb, waiting, as though he had been there all along, just wait. ING for her to come back. But the corner was empty. A few people stood nearby, huddled in jackets against the cold, but no sign of the man she had seen yesterday. She felt a pang of disappointment, a small but sharp feeling that cut through her determination. She checked the alleyways next. The spaces between buildings, dark and often littered with discarded food wrappers and broken furniture, were places where the homeless often sought refuge. But the alleyways were quiet, save for the occasional stray cat darting between the dumpsters. Lisa paused, her heart sinking slightly. She had been expecting some kind of miracle, that Tom would somehow still be there, as though the universe had somehow conspired to give her a chance to make things right. But the truth was clear. She was alone in this. Minutes turned into an hour as Lisa walked up and down the streets, searching. Her usual method of simply knowing where to go, of following the rhythms of the city, wasn't working here. She wasn't just a police officer anymore. She was someone trying to bridge a gap, trying to understand something she had avoided for years. The whole process felt painfully unfamiliar. There were so many other homeless individuals around, and Lisa didn't know who was his story, who was Tom. She could ask people, but that felt like an invasion of privacy. She could post a search, but she knew that wouldn't be enough. She had to find him herself. Her frustration grew. She had been on countless cases, dealt with dangerous criminals, had even been in life-threatening situations, and yet this was more intimidating than anything she had faced. It wasn't a criminal, it wasn't a drug addict or an abuser. It was a man who simply wanted to be seen. And now Lisa felt completely out of her depth. She wasn't sure where to go, how to help, or what to even say if she did find him. Just as Lisa was about to give up, her radio crackled to life. It was a familiar voice. Officer Dan Hurst, a colleague she'd worked with many times before. "Monroe," he said, his tone casual. "We got a call on 6th and Oak. You want to handle it?" Lisa hesitated. She had already put off responding to several calls that morning, and her shift was almost over. The streets were calling her back to the routine of her job, taking care of business, moving on, keeping things moving forward. But as she looked down the street at the crowds, at the endless lines of people rushing from one point to another, she realized that her routine had never felt so empty. She wasn't helping anyone this way. Not really. She pushed the button on her radio and responded, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm going to pass on this one. I've got something I need to take care of." Dan didn't question her. He knew her well enough to know when she was determined to handle something herself. Lisa took a deep breath and turned away from the noise of the city. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the sidewalk, trying to regain her bearings. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but she couldn't ignore the pull to keep going. She had been taught to trust her instincts, but now, those instincts felt like they were failing her. She had always been able to predict where things were headed, to see a situation and know how to handle it. But this was a different kind of challenge. It wasn't about criminals or suspects. It was about a man who had fallen through the cracks, and Lisa wasn't sure where to begin to pick him up. A thought crossed her mind. Maybe he hadn't gone far. Maybe he had simply moved on to one of the shelters, one of the places she knew about but had never fully considered. With new resolve, she turned toward the nearby Veterans Outreach Center she had passed by many times but never really paid attention to. It was only a few blocks away, tucked between a cafe and an office building. Lisa knew it was one of the places people who had served in the military could go for assistance, shelter, food, counseling. But, again, she had always thought of it as just another resource in the city's complex web of services. She had never thought of it as a way to help someone like Tom. As Lisa approached the entrance to the outreach center, she hesitated. There was a large poster outside with information about upcoming support groups and emergency services, but the doors were closed. The lights inside were dim, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Lisa paused, fingers brushing the door handle, unsure if she was about to make a mistake or take a step in the right direction. A man stepped out from behind the building as she stood there. He looked familiar. His worn coat and the sad slump of his shoulders reminded her of the people she passed by every day, people who lived in the shadows of society. But there was something else in his posture, something that told Lisa this was no ordinary person. She took a step toward him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice almost tentative. "I'm looking for someone. His name is Tom. He's a veteran. Have you seen him around?" The man turned to face her, his expression a mixture of surprise and recognition. After a brief silence, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You mean the guy who was here last night?" "Yeah, I saw him. He's been coming by a lot recently, but I think he left this morning. He said something about heading to the riverfront. Might want to try there." The riverfront. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She had passed the river several times during her patrols, but she had never thought to look there. It wasn't a common spot for the homeless, at least not the ones she usually saw in the more densely populated parts of downtown. It was an unfamiliar stretch of the city for her. "Thank you," she said, more determined now than ever. As the man walked away, Lisa felt a surge of energy. The riverfront might have been the least expected place, but it was her best lead. It felt like a stretch, a leap of faith, but something about it felt right. For the first time since she had made the decision to find Tom, she wasn't simply walking through the motions. She was taking real steps, venturing into the unfamiliar. With renewed determination, she made her way toward the riverfront. The path ahead was uncertain, but Lisa knew one thing for sure. She wasn't about to give up now. As Lisa made her way toward the riverfront, the noise of the city gradually began to fade. The hum of traffic, the clamor of pedestrians, and the cacophony of urban life dimmed behind her, and she found herself in a quieter, more solitary part of Portland. The riverfront area was peaceful, but in a way that made her feel more alone than ever. It was here, on this stretch of the city, where people like Tom sometimes vanished, not because they chose to, but because the streets here offered anonymity and a kind of solitude that even the busiest parts of town could not provide. The area was quiet, save for the occasional jogger or cyclist who sped past her on the river trail. She walked at a slow pace, scanning the riverbank and the scattered benches along the path, hoping for a glimpse of Tom or some sign that he had been there. The quietness of the riverfront was comforting, yet unsettling at the same time. It reminded Lisa of how many people pass through her life every day, people whose stories she never really knew, never bothered to learn. She had treated them all the same, like background noise, easily ignored as she focused on her duties. Now, however, she felt every step, every breath, every moment of this unfamiliar search. There was no police radio crackling with calls to drown out her thoughts, no scheduled patrols to keep her distracted. It was just her and the weight of her decision to step outside her comfort zone. The riverfront was lined with small parks, benches, and occasional patches of overgrown grass, but there were no obvious signs of Tom. Lisa found herself at a small pier that jutted out into the water, the planks creaking underfoot as she made her way toward the edge. She paused, looking out over the water, wondering if she had missed him or if he had simply disappeared. Her mind drifted back to the brief exchange they had shared the day before, the way he had looked at her. She could still see his weathered face, the dullness in his eyes that seemed to suggest a life that had been ground down by years of hardship. It was then that she saw something, a figure sitting alone at the far end of the pier. For a moment, her heart skipped. She walked toward it, her pace quickening, her stomach churning with anticipation. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to acknowledge her presence. As she neared, she could make out the details of the person's appearance. The man was hunched over, head down, hands tucked into the sleeves of his jacket. His posture reminded her so much of Tom, slumped, worn down by life. But as Lisa came closer, she realized that the man sitting there wasn't Tom. For a moment, disappointment threatened to undo her. She stopped just short of approaching the stranger, unsure whether to disturb him. But then something inside her pushed her forward. This was the part she had to get through, the part where her emotions might try to stop her, where the discomfort and uncertainty of the unknown would force her to question her decision. She had already come this far. She couldn't afford to let herself retreat now. Lisa cleared her throat gently as she approached the man. He looked up slowly, revealing a tired face with deep lines etched from years of struggle. He was older than Tom, but there was something familiar about him. His eyes were wide, though they seemed to avoid direct contact with hers. Lisa took a deep breath. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tentative but firm. "I'm looking for someone. His name is Tom. He's a veteran, been on the streets for a while now. Have you seen him around?" The man blinked, and for a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Lisa couldn't tell if he was simply too lost in his own world to answer, or if he was just choosing not to speak. Finally, he nodded slowly, his gaze still averted. "You're not the first one to come looking for him," the man said in a gravelly voice. "Tom? Yeah, he's been around here a lot, especially lately. But I saw him earlier this morning. He wasn't staying here. He's got a place he likes up in the old underpass near the train tracks." Lisa nodded quickly, her pulse quickening with hope. "Do you know if he'll be there later? I really need to speak with him." The man shrugged, his face unreadable. "You never know with him. Sometimes he just disappears for days. But yeah, that's his spot. You'll find him there if anyone can tell you where he's gone." Lisa gave the man a brief nod of thanks, then turned to walk away. Her mind was racing. The underpass. That was a spot she had seen before, but it had always seemed like a place of last resort, a spot for the truly desperate. She had never once considered it as a place to search for someone like Tom. But now, the unfamiliarity of it all seemed like a challenge she could overcome. She had to find him. She had to make things right. As Lisa made her way toward the underpass, she felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. The streets, which had once been her domain, now seemed like an alien landscape. It was one thing to patrol these areas in her uniform, where her presence was a symbol of authority, of protection. But now, she wasn't just a police officer. She was a person trying to make a human connection, and that, more than anything, terrified her. The underpass was located just past an industrial area that was largely abandoned except for a few cars parked along the street. As she approached, Lisa noticed how quiet the area felt, the kind of quiet that made her feel exposed. It was one of those places that people forgot about, hidden from view. The air felt cooler here, heavy with the scent of damp concrete and rust. She turned the corner, peering into the shadows under the bridge. The overhang created an eerie stillness, the dark corners of the underpass filled with discarded belongings and forgotten memories. The sound of rushing water below echoed, but it was otherwise completely silent. Lisa took a deep breath and stepped forward, scanning the shadows. The air smelled faintly of mildew and old cardboard, remnants of lives lived in between moments of shelter and survival. A few empty bottles were scattered across the ground, the remains of someone who had passed through recently. She didn't feel like she was in danger. No one had jumped out at her, no immediate threats, but she couldn't shake the sense of unease that gripped her. This was unfamiliar territory. She had no idea who might be lurking in the shadows, no sense of how to navigate this world of homelessness, of displacement. As she walked deeper into the underpass, Lisa caught sight of a figure huddled near the far wall. The man was sitting with his back against the concrete, his legs pulled up to his chest, eyes closed as though he were asleep. She stepped closer, her heart racing. The man had a jacket similar to the one Tom had been wearing, but as she got closer, she realized this wasn't him either.
Another man.
Another person who had fallen through the cracks. Lisa's frustration began to build again, the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on her chest. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up the search, how much longer she could keep trying to connect with people who seemed to be always slipping further away. But then, as if on cue, the man shifted. His eyes opened slowly, revealing the same tired, clouded gaze Lisa had seen the day before. "Tom?" she asked, almost breathlessly. The man looked up at her, his face softening in recognition. For a moment, there was only silence, a brief moment of stillness between them. Then, finally, he nodded, his voice quiet but steady.
"Yeah.
I'm Tom." Lisa felt a rush of relief, mixed with apprehension. She had found him, finally. But now the real work began. The air in the underpass was damp and heavy, but for Lisa, it seemed to thicken with the weight of the moment. She had found Tom. After hours of searching, of wandering through the unfamiliar streets of Portland, she had finally tracked him down. And yet, as she stood there looking at him, her heart raced not out of triumph, but with a deep, gnawing uncertainty. What now? She had thought that finding him would solve everything, that the moment their eyes met, everything would fall into place, her doubts would disappear, and she would know exactly what to do. But standing there, in the cold shadows beneath the bridge, she realized that the task ahead of her was far more complicated than she had imagined. Tom, his face a mixture of weariness and guardedness, hadn't moved much since she'd spoken his name. His eyes, clouded, distant, remained locked on her, but there was no warmth in his gaze. Lisa had expected to see some flicker of recognition, maybe a spark of hope, but all she saw was exhaustion, as if he were too tired to care whether she had come to help or to judge. It wasn't the response she had imagined, the response she had wanted to see. She had pictured this moment in her mind 1,000 times, her reaching out, Tom accepting her help, and them walking away together, his future suddenly filled with possibility. But that was a dream. The reality was much more fragile. Tom, Lisa repeated, her voice softer now, almost tentative, as she took a cautious step forward. I'm Officer Lisa Monroe. I've been looking for you. Tom didn't immediately respond. Instead, he shifted his position slightly, wrapping his arms around his knees and pulling them tighter to his chest. His eyes dropped back to the ground, and for a moment, Lisa wondered if he would just ignore her, pretend she wasn't there, as so many had done before. But then, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice low, rough, like gravel scraping against stone. What do you want from me? Tom's question hung in the air, thick with suspicion. There was a hardness in his tone that made Lisa flinch, a layer of resentment that made her feel like an intruder. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to center herself. She had prepared for this moment, for the possibility that he might reject her, but the reality of it was still jarring. She had been trained to handle resistance from criminals, to deal with suspects who were unwilling to cooperate, but this was different. This wasn't about catching someone in a lie or forcing them into compliance. This was about trust, and trust was not something easily earned, especially not from someone who had been abandoned by society, someone who had learned to distrust the world around him. I'm not here to hurt you, she said carefully, lowering her voice. I'm here to help. I can get you into a shelter, get you resources.
You don't have to stay out here, Tom.
There's a way out of this if you want it. Tom's head jerked up, his eyes flashing with something like anger, something sharp and fleeting. Help, he scoffed. You mean lock me up in some place where they tell me when I can eat, when I can sleep? Is that your idea of help? Lisa's chest tightened at his words. She had heard this kind of skepticism before. But it was different now. There was no badge to hide behind, no routine to shield her from the uncomfortable truth of what he was saying. The system that she worked for was not perfect. In fact, it often felt like the system she served only perpetuated the problem, pushing people like Tom into deeper isolation rather than offering them real solutions. No, she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. It's not like that. I'm talking about a chance, Tom. A real chance to get back on your feet. There are programs out there, veterans programs that can help you. You've been through more than most people could imagine. You deserve better than this. For the first time, Tom looked directly at her, his gaze piercing, as if trying to read her, trying to decide whether she was another well-meaning officer or someone truly offering a way out. His eyes were hollow, empty, and it made her heart ache. You don't get it, he said, shaking his head slowly. I don't want your help. I've been through those programs before. I've been promised a fresh start. It doesn't work. They don't care about people like me. They just want to check off a box on a form and forget about you the moment you're gone. Lisa felt a sharp pang in her chest. She knew that Tom's words held truth. The system was far from perfect. She knew that all too well. But his bitterness cut deeper than she had expected. He wasn't just skeptical. He was broken. worn down by a system that had repeatedly failed him. And her own helplessness in the face of that reality made her feel more vulnerable than she had ever been in her career. "I know it's not perfect," she said softly, "but I'm not here to force you into anything. I just want to give you a chance, something real, something different. You deserve to feel safe, Tom. You deserve to have a future. You don't have to live like this." Tom's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, as if he were considering her words, but then his expression hardened again. He looked away, pulling his knees up higher, as if retreating further into himself. "Look, lady," he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with exhaustion. "You don't know me. You don't know what it's like to wake up every day not knowing where your next meal's coming from, or where you're going to sleep. You don't know what it's like to be invisible, to have everyone walk by you like you're nothing. I've seen it all. I've heard it all. I've been to those shelters. You think they care about me? You think they care about anyone who's been out here this long? No, they don't. And neither do you." His words stung, but Lisa didn't react. She simply stood there, her heart heavy with the weight of his truth. She had heard his story before, in different forms, in different faces, but never had it hit so close to home. She had wanted to save him. She had wanted to believe that there was an easy way out, that she could fix the pieces of his broken life with a few well-chosen words. But it wasn't that simple. His walls were built from years of pain, betrayal, and neglect, and no amount of good intentions could tear them down. Tom fell silent again, the gap between them widening. For a moment, Lisa just stood there, unsure of what to do next. She had always been good at following orders, at completing the mission at hand. But this was different. This wasn't about a mission. This wasn't about bringing in a criminal or solving a case. This was about human connection, and that, in this moment, felt far more complicated than any arrest she had ever made. But Lisa wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't be. Not yet. If she was going to make any difference, she needed to get through to him. She needed him to see that she wasn't like everyone else who had failed him in the past. She crouched down slowly, so that she was at his level, not towering over him as an authority figure, but as a fellow human being. "Tom," she said gently, "I get that you're scared. I get that you've been let down by people before. But I'm not asking you to trust me completely. I'm just asking for a chance, for you to give yourself a chance. You don't have to do this alone anymore." There was a long, pregnant pause before Tom spoke again, his voice barely audible. "You're right," he said quietly, almost too quietly to hear. "I don't have to do this alone. But I don't know how to trust anymore." Lisa sat there for a long time, letting his words hang in the air. And in that silence, she understood. This was not a victory, not yet. It was a step, just a small, uncertain step, but it was a step nonetheless. A step toward rebuilding trust, toward finding a way forward, even if it meant taking it one fragile moment at a time. The next few days after her conversation with Tom felt like a blur. Lisa couldn't shake the image of him huddled beneath that bridge, the shadows clinging to him like an old, familiar coat. She had tried, with everything she had, to convince him that there was a way out, that there was help available if he was willing to take the first step. But it was clear now. Nothing would come easily. Nothing would unfold in the neat, tidy way that Lisa had envisioned. The first crack in her optimism appeared when she tried to follow up on the promises she had made. She had contacted the local Veterans Support Services, securing a spot for Tom in a shelter that specialized in helping homeless veterans. She had even called ahead, making sure they would have a bed available for him. She had thought, with a certain naive confidence, that once Tom understood he had a real chance for stability, he would take it. But when she returned to the underpass, she found the familiar solitude that had marked his absence before. Tom had vanished again. Lisa's phone rang constantly, each call from the shelter or a program she had reached out to, but each one only reminded her of the growing distance between her and the man she was trying so desperately to help. No matter how much she reached out, no matter how many resources she made available to him, Tom refused to show up, refused to engage. The first time she returned to the shelter with hope in her heart, she found herself standing in a stark, sterile hallway filled with faces that spoke to their own histories of abandonment addiction, and failure. There were men who looked at her with gratitude, some with hope, but most with a weary sense of resignation. A few had seen Tom come through the door before, but he had never stayed long. He never made it past the intake process, always vanishing just before they could help him get the paperwork done or claim a bed for the night. She had hoped, she had clung to the idea that Tom might be different, but the reality was sinking in. He was just like the rest of them, another face in the crowd of lost souls, another veteran who had slipped through the cracks of a system that was supposed to save him. The disillusionment crept up on her like a creeping fog. Every time she spoke to someone who was trying to help, every time she made another phone call to see if Tom had finally checked in, she felt a little bit more defeated. But what frustrated Lisa the most was her inability to comprehend why he refused to trust her, why he turned away from the very thing she had promised him: safety, stability, and a chance at a better life. She spent hours sitting in her patrol car, parked at the edge of the riverfront, trying to figure out where she had gone wrong. She wasn't supposed to get emotionally attached. She knew that. She had told herself over and over that her job wasn't to save anyone. But that was exactly what she had tried to do with Tom. She had tried to save him. And now, she was confronted with a painful truth. Some people couldn't be saved, at least not in the way she had imagined. Her colleagues noticed the change in her. Lisa had always been the officer who could stay cool under pressure, the one who could remain detached when faced with difficult situations. But in the days following her encounters with Tom, her demeanor became more withdrawn. Her usual easygoing attitude had hardened into something brittle. She became short with the people she worked with, and her patrols felt like a series of mechanical movements, her mind always drifting back to Tom, always wondering where he was, whether he was still alive, whether he was okay. One evening, her partner, Officer Marcus Lane, pulled her aside after their shift. He had been watching her for days, noticing the change in her behavior. "Lisa," Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with concern, "you've been distracted lately. Something's going on. What's going on with you?" Lisa hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to letting her guard down, especially not to a fellow officer. But Marcus had been her partner for years, and there was something in his tone, a softness, an understanding, that made her feel safe enough to speak. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Marcus," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could help him. I thought I could fix him, you know?
But he won't let me.
And I don't know how to make it stop hurting. I've been trying so hard to get through to him, to give him the chance he deserves. But every time I reach out, he pulls further away. It's like I'm chasing a ghost." Marcus sighed deeply, his face softening with empathy. "You can't save everyone, Lisa," he said gently. "No matter how much you want it, no matter how hard you try. Some people don't want to be saved. And the system, the way we try to fix things, it doesn't always work the way we think it should." Lisa shook her head, frustration building in her chest. "But I know there's a way out for him. I know he deserves a chance. I just need him to want it." "I get that," Marcus said, his voice low and understanding. "But you're paying a price for something that might not even happen. You're draining yourself. And for what? For him to make a decision that's not even in your control? Sometimes you've just got to let it go." His words stung. She hadn't realized it until he pointed it out, but Marcus was right. She had become consumed with this idea of saving Tom, of proving to herself, and to everyone else, that she could make a difference. But in doing so, she had forgotten something critical: her own well-being. She had spent so much time trying to fix Tom's brokenness that she had failed to recognize the toll it was taking on her. She was burning herself out. She was stretching herself too thin, expecting too much from a system that didn't have the resources or the compassion to meet Tom where he was. After that conversation with Marcus, Lisa took a step back, if only for a moment. The relief of being honest, of expressing her frustration, was overwhelming. She felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but the relief was brief. The truth was, she couldn't just turn off her desire to help. It wasn't that simple. But she had to, accept that she wasn't going to fix everything. And the price of trying to fix things that were out of her control was far too high. That night, As Lisa sat in her patrol car alone, the rain softly tapping against the windows, she thought about everything she had learned. The truth wasn't in the success or failure of one mission. The truth was in the acceptance that there were things she couldn't change, things that weren't hers to control. And as much as she wanted to make Tom's life better, she couldn't force him to want help. She couldn't force him to change.
She had wanted to help him, yes.
But more than that, she had wanted to feel like she mattered. She wanted to believe that her presence in this world could make a difference, that all her hard work, her long hours, and her sacrifices could lead to something meaningful. But as she sat there in her car, looking out at the wet streets of Portland, she understood that the price she was paying wasn't just for Tom's indifference, it was for her own need to fix a broken world. And that was something that could never be satisfied. Lisa's return to the usual rhythm of her life was not as seamless as she had imagined. On the surface, it appeared that things were back to normal. The routine of her daily patrols resumed, the hum of her car's engine, the endless calls over the radio, and the familiar faces in the precinct. But beneath the surface, something had irrevocably changed. She had seen and felt something in herself she could no longer ignore, a deep, humbling shift in perspective that altered her understanding of her role, both as a police officer and as a human being. In the weeks that followed, Lisa found herself wrestling with the delicate balance between the demands of her job and her newfound self-awareness. Her conversations with her colleagues became more reflective. No longer did she think of herself solely as a protector or a savior. Now, she saw herself as a part of something much larger, something complex and imperfect. The idea that she could fix or save everyone had crumbled. That truth was painful, but also freeing. She began to understand that her worth wasn't measured by the number of lives she could save or the impact she could have on the broken parts of society. What mattered now was the way she interacted with people, the compassion she showed, and the respect she offered even when it seemed like the world was too far gone to change. It wasn't about solving problems with a neat solution, but about listening, being present, and accepting that some battles weren't hers to win. The first time Lisa drove past the underpass where she had seen Tom, she felt a pang in her chest. The area was now quieter, less populated, but there were still the signs of hardship, discarded clothes, empty bottles, abandoned shopping carts. She slowed the car, her gaze lingering on the shadows beneath the bridge. For a moment, she thought she saw someone who looked like him, hunched over in the same posture he had when they first spoke. But when she squinted, the figure moved away, and Lisa realized it wasn't Tom at all. Her heart beat faster for a moment, an old instinct kicking in. For weeks, she had been obsessed with Tom's well-being, consumed by the hope that he would eventually show up, seek out the help she had offered. But now, instead of rushing to find him, Lisa simply exhaled, feeling the weight of those months lifting off her shoulders. She didn't need to save him. She didn't need to force a change that he wasn't ready to embrace. What she needed was to accept that she had done what she could. She had offered him a chance. It wasn't her responsibility to drag him across the threshold of change if he wasn't willing to cross it himself. There were limits to what any one person could do. And while it had taken her a long time to admit it, Lisa finally understood that her own life didn't need to revolve around rescuing others. She could only offer the tools for change. What people did with those tools was beyond her control. Lisa's growth, however, was not without its challenges. The work still felt heavy at times. She would be lying if she said that the weight of her empathy, the frustration of seeing systemic failures, didn't continue to haunt her. She couldn't shake the images of the men and women she had met in her career, people like Tom, who seemed stuck in a cycle that no amount of effort could break. There were times when she felt helpless, when it seemed as though the system was too broken, too corrupt, to ever offer a true solution. But instead of withdrawing into cynicism, Lisa began to engage in the system differently. Instead of working within the rigid confines of right and wrong, she allowed herself to become more fluid, more adaptable, finding small victories where she could. She became more of a listener, more of a guide than a savior. She reached out to organizations that focused on mental health services for homeless veterans. She attended community meetings where policymakers discussed the challenges of homelessness and veteran care. She began to speak up in her department about the gaps she had witnessed, offering insights from her own experience. While she couldn't change everything, she was learning to play a part in a larger movement. Instead of burning herself out trying to fix the world, Lisa found ways to influence it subtly, to guide it in directions that could eventually make a difference. Her relationships with her colleagues also shifted. Lisa had always been somewhat of a loner in the precinct, reserved, careful with her emotions, and focused entirely on the job. But now, she began to open up more, sharing her experiences and vulnerabilities with those she trusted. It wasn't easy at first. She was still the strong, reliable officer who had a reputation for never showing weakness, for always keeping her head down and her emotions in check. But in talking with Marcus, with her supervisor, and even with other officers she had never been close to, Lisa realized the power of vulnerability. The more she opened herself up, the more she felt connected to the human side of law enforcement, the side that didn't just enforce rules, but that cared about the people they were serving. Her friendship with Marcus deepened as well. In the weeks that followed their conversation about Tom, Marcus became a confidant, someone who didn't offer easy answers, but simply listened. It was in these conversations late at night after a long shift that Lisa began to understand how much her work had defined her and how much of her identity had been wrapped up in being the officer who fixed people. Marcus, who had always been a steady presence in her life, reminded her that true change wasn't about immediate results. Sometimes it was about planting seeds, leaving a mark that might not bear fruit for years. And there were small victories. Lisa began to see some of the people she had worked with make incremental progress. She saw one of the veterans she had helped get into a temporary shelter finally take the first steps toward employment. She saw a woman she had arrested years ago for shoplifting finally break free from addiction and start a rehabilitation program. These weren't dramatic successes, but they were significant. And they were proof that change, though slow, was possible. Yet even as Lisa grew into this more balanced, more self-aware version of herself, there was a lingering ache in her heart, the ache of knowing that there would always be more work to be done, more broken lives, more lost people. She couldn't change everything. She couldn't fix everyone. But she could keep showing up, keep offering the same level of compassion and care she had always believed in, even when it seemed futile. She could continue to be the best version of herself, not for the sake of being a hero, but because it was the right thing to do. She could offer what she had, and then let go. One afternoon, as Lisa walked into the precinct, she saw a familiar face in the lobby. It was Tom. He was standing by the bulletin board, flipping through the flyers about available shelters and programs. He looked worn, but there was something different about him. Something more open, less guarded than when they had first met. For a moment, Lisa hesitated. Her first instinct was to rush toward him, to offer him help again. But she stopped herself. She had already offered him everything she could. The next steps were his to take. Instead of approaching him immediately, she stood at a distance, watching him carefully. And then, for the first time in months, Tom turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm not here for the shelter," he said quietly, his voice rough but not as hardened as before. "I just came to say, thank you for trying." Lisa nodded, her chest tight. "You're welcome," she said softly. There was no dramatic resolution, no fairy tale ending. But in that moment, standing across the room from Tom, Lisa realized that this quiet recognition, this subtle connection, was enough. She didn't need him to accept her help. She didn't need to see him walk away from the streets and into a better life to know that she had made a difference. Sometimes the most important thing was just showing up, just letting people know that they mattered. Even when it didn't change the world, it could change the way someone saw themselves. Lisa smiled, a small, bittersweet smile, and turned away. She didn't need to chase after him anymore. She had found something far more valuable: peace with the work she had done, and the understanding that there was no single, perfect way to heal the world. Sometimes it was enough just to offer a hand and let people take it when they were ready. As Lisa walked out into the bright afternoon, she realized that this, too, was part of her evolution. learning to let go of the need to control the outcomes, and instead finding fulfillment in the small moments of connection, of empathy, and of change. There would always be more work to do, but now she could face it with a quieter heart, a more open mind, and the understanding that the journey, both hers and others, was ongoing.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.